Good morning. The scripture reading is from Acts 17, 16 through 31. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling or hearing something new. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To the unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and places to live, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way to him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance of God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning. Today's message might kind of feel like two small messages jammed into one place. The first half is really just going to be laying down some biblical principles. And then the second half is going to be one very timely application. And I've entitled the message today, Halloween and the Christian, because it's good for us to pause and really think about how Christians ought to respond to trends in our culture. And Halloween customs are, of course, no exception to that. It's really no small event in our culture or even in our own community. Every year, Americans spend somewhere around the range of $7 billion on Halloween costumes and decorations. Nearly half of your neighbors will decorate their homes in some fashion for Halloween. More than 6 out of 10 adults are going to dress up in a costume on October 31st. 1 in 7 adults are going to dress up their pets. Does anyone know what the most popular pet costume was last year? What was the most popular pet costume? A pumpkin. Pumpkin. What was the second most popular costume? A hot dog. Yes. Thinking more broadly, though, than just this one event in our culture, Halloween. At its heart, today's message is really about how should Christians respond to culture? How should Christians respond to culture? Now, the word culture is kind of a funny word because it tends to be kind of a junk drawer term that we just kind of can throw everything inside. Ask someone on the street what the definition of culture is and just see what they say. It's a bit like trying to ask a fish to define what water is. When we try to think of what culture is, it just seems like everything around us is a manifestation of culture in some way. It's just the atmosphere of our daily lives. From the architecture of the building that we're standing inside, to the kind of food that we eat, the music we listen to, the movies we watch, the language we speak, the figures of speech we use, the clothing we wear, all of it relates to culture. But just so we can kind of narrow it down, just so we can kind of, for the sake of getting somewhere this morning, I'm going to use a definition by Robert Redfield, who was a 20th century anthropologist. This is how he defined culture. He said, culture is the shared understandings made manifest in act and artifact. The shared understandings made manifest in act and artifact. What does that mean? I'll break that down a little bit here. First, culture comes from shared understandings. Shared understandings. When we talk about culture, we're just not talking about something that I think or something that you think. We're talking about something that a whole group of people thinks and believes. It's a shared understanding of the world. And then second, that shared understanding is expressed in act and artifact. So that includes our customs, that includes our common behaviors, our language. It includes the art we make, the music we record, the plays we perform, the films we produce, the literature we write, even the holidays we celebrate, like Halloween. Those are all artifacts of culture. Now, in this book, in the book of Acts, in the sermon that we just heard from the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, we get a glimpse of the way Paul handled culture. Just like a lot of big cities today, Athens was an epicenter of culture. Athens had a huge influence. It also had a very proud legacy as well. It produced some of the finest and brightest minds that history has ever known, and even names that we still recognize today: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. It was the cradle of democracy. It was an important center of art and learning. It was a center of culture. Now, we don't have time to explore this text in full. If I had 10 Sundays in a row to explore this text, I probably still could not do it justice because it is so rich. So I'm only really going to draw out one principle today, one theme. How did Paul respond to culture? And I'll then make one very contemporary application, and I'll talk about Halloween. Now, with anything in culture, there are three general responses that Christians can have to those things in culture. And here they are: receive, reject, and redeem. Receive, reject, redeem. So let's draw each of these out of the text so we can see how Paul did this. First is receive. Now, this one is probably the hardest to see in the text because it's actually the most obvious thing that we completely overlook it. Notice the forums for Paul's preaching. Where does he preach? Where does he present the gospel? Where did he engage with people? Did he build a church building? No. Did he set up a tent in the wilderness somewhere and ask people to come out to see him? No. He was in the marketplace. He went to the synagogue. He even went up to the high court, the Areopagus, the high court of Athens. He preached and taught at the crossroads of religion and education and commerce and politics. And you see, Paul and his companions, they could walk the same Roman roads, sail on the same Roman ships alongside any pagan without any stain on their conscience because they simply received a lot of these things as artifacts of culture that they could receive as good gifts. They received them with a heart of thanksgiving. And this is true for all of us well. There's a lot of things in our culture that are just part of God's common mercies for all people. These are things Christians can freely receive, and we don't need to try to Christianize them at all. Today, I can appreciate the electricity that flows through my home without any sense of guilt that the electric company isn't owned by Christian people. I can buy a computer without a concern that the programmers might be Hindus or Muslims or even secularists. This category of receive is really, really huge, actually, because so much falls into it. There are so many examples of this. The next is reject. Where do we see Paul do this reject? Notice how the text starts here. Paul is in Athens, and his spirit is provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. There's actually an ancient historian, lived a couple thousand years ago, and he jokingly said, when he was commenting about the city of Athens, when you could see all the statues of all the gods everywhere, he says there was more gods in Athens than there were people. It's because it was full of gods, full of different gods. There were gods everywhere that people in Athens worshipped. All these gods had their own cults. All these gods had their own mythologies. All of them had worshipers. And all of them were rivals of the true God of Israel. To a good Bible-believing man like Paul, who grew up learning the law of Moses, these graven images all around him were abominations to him. So this is why it says his spirit is provoked within him. It agitated him to see all these different gods. In fact, Paul's problem with idolatry is one of the sustaining themes of the entire text of this whole story. This is the central idea of his message to the high court in Athens. This is the reject part. He flat out rejects any notion that these idols are good at all. He points to these statues and these temples, and he calls them false. He says, look, any real God, like the Creator God, doesn't live in temples made by man as if we could just contain him somehow. The real God doesn't need anything from us, as if he was lacking something. He isn't limited to human ingenuity and creativity. He isn't made of gold or silver or stone, and he can't be represented by a man-made image. So Paul is unabashedly rejecting the polytheistic beliefs of Athens' cultural history. He is rejecting the artifacts of that belief, the temples, the pagan customs and sacrifices, the statues of gold. All of it was false, and he's unapologetic about it. So there are some actions and artifacts of our culture that are inherently sinful. Paul says in his first letter to the Corinthians, for instance, while he could easily eat the meat sold in the pagan marketplace, even if that meat had been used in some sort of pagan sacrifice somewhere, he would still never attend a pagan worship service and eat and drink at the table dedicated to demons. Those two were separate things in his mind. He could receive the meat gladly from the marketplace, but he would reject anything that had to do with eating that meat at the table dedicated to a demon. And there are some things in our culture that simply have no place, some cultural things that have no place in the life of a Christian. For instance, you could never be the owner of a strip club and do it in a Christian way. It can't happen. There are things inherent to the business enterprise that are sinful. And you cannot mix them. You cannot mix Christian ethics with that business enterprise or with that cultural artifact. You cannot do it. It must be totally rejected. So we've looked at receive, we've looked at reject. Now let's look at redeem. Let's look at redeem. Now, this is really interesting. When you see Paul's approach to this, notice what he does in this sermon. This is brilliant, really. Speaking out in this court of law, he says, the Creator God wants us to seek him. God is not far from each of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. And then he says, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring. Now that quote, for we are indeed his offspring, do you know where that comes from? It comes from a very famous poem that any educated Athenian would have known well. The poem was called The Phenomena, and it was written several hundred years before Paul and by one of the most famous Greek poets, a man named Aratus. Now, Aratus' poem, Phenomena, was a pretty ambitious poem. It was a poem all about the heavens. So he writes this poem out, all these things taking place in the heavens. He writes about dozens of constellations and the sun and the moon and the planets and even weather patterns. But it wasn't just some sort of farmer's almanac. What he was doing was he was combining all the best information, scientific information about the heavens, and combining it with poetry. It was a very ambitious poem, and the Athenians and every Greek, they ate this poem up. They loved this poem. Now listen to Aratus' opening lines of the poem. Here's his opening lines. Let us begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor are full of his deity. Everywhere everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring. There it is. You see that last line? For we are indeed his offspring. That's where Paul's getting the quote from. Now, right away, you should be wondering something. Why in the world is Paul quoting this poem? Who are these lines about? Who are these lines about? Zeus. Now, if you know your Greek mythology, Zeus is probably familiar to you. He was the sky god of the ancient Greeks. He was the chief god that ruled from Mount Olympus. He was a pagan god. Now, by the time Aratus had come along, many of the educated Athenians had rejected a lot of the old mythologies of the ancient Greeks, and they knew they were just sort of stories. But the Stoic philosophers, like Aratus, still used the name Zeus as a way of talking about this force that permeated all things, a power that held all things together. Now, track with me here. Now, get this is important. They didn't think of Zeus anymore as just some immortal person in the sky who looked like a man. The Stoics were pantheists. You know what I mean when I say they're a pantheist? Pantheism is the belief that the universe or all of nature is one with deity. That there's this sort of impersonal force of reason and life that just fills and permeates everything. It isn't at all the God of the Bible, not even close. The God of the Bible is extremely personal and transcendent over the universe. But they believed in this divine life, this impersonal force, like the soul of the world or a life force that brings order to everything. That's what this poem is dedicated to. Now, right away, you should be wondering, why in the world is Paul using this poem? He's trying to make his case before these philosophers about Jesus. Why on earth does he quote a famous poem dedicated to a pantheistic God? Well, all you have to do is read the rest of the sermon to know that Paul isn't endorsing pantheism at all. I mean, it's really obvious he's not. Not even close. He uses all these personal action verbs to describe God. God is one who makes the world. He makes human beings. He appointed Christ to judge the worlds. These are not actions that can be taken by some sort of pantheistic force in the universe. And yet Paul still quotes this poem. Why? This shows us our third category. Paul didn't just receive Aratus' work as an artifact of culture. He also didn't just flat out reject it as a poem of the ramblings of a mad pagan mind. Paul redeemed it. And what do I mean by that? To redeem means to recover something from the power of something else. To redeem something, to redeem a part of our culture, is to recognize that there are important truths within it. But there are truths that have been twisted and misused and combined with error. So we redeem or we recover those truths for godly purposes. We're saying there's truth somewhere in there. Something rings true in that, and I'm going to pull that out. I'm going to redeem that from within the lies that it's contained. In this case, Paul's point's really clear to these Athenians. He says, look, even your own poets have said that we are the offspring of the great divine being. So you already recognize that God can't be adequately represented in statues of wood or stone or gold. You Stoics at least have that much right. You have that much right. You are right about that. This was Paul's strategy. He was redeeming lines from this classic work of literature without endorsing it wholesale. And this can be our strategy too when it comes to culture. Receive, reject, redeem. There are a lot of things that can fit into this redeem category. Things that in our culture like music or poetry or films or intellectual movements that have made some true assertions, but they have been mixed with lies. Rather than rejecting them wholesale and retreating into a world where we only look at Christian art, only listen to Christian music, only read Christian literature, and only watch Christian films, or only participate in Christian culture, we can enter our contemporary culture and interact with it. Really redeem it. So what I'd like to do this morning, for the last half of this message, is I'd like to make one contemporary application to the application of Halloween, which is a timely cultural artifact. We are just a few days away from Halloween, so it's appropriate to try to make this application. We're going to do this in order to make this principle really real to us this morning. Much of modern Halloween today is really a mixture of a lot of innocent intentions of kids dressing up in cute little outfits to get candy, and then this pervasive atmosphere of horror and death. Now, if you talk to Christians who know a thing or two about neo-paganism, like Wicca or modern witchcraft or the occult, they have a very strong aversion to Halloween because they know that so many of the practices are rooted in old pagan and even modern satanic practices. So the entire notion of participating in anything that has to do with Halloween is abhorrent. To them, everything about October 31st is something to reject, not just to avoid the appearance of evil, but to actually avoid commingling with evil itself. They would say that when we look past all the benign outfits of little kids, you actually see an environment engulfed in the celebration of the demonic and the occult. So to many Christians, Halloween fits squarely into the reject category. Nothing about it is redeemable. A look back in history could really be helpful here, though. So we're going to look back in the history of Halloween. We're going to show you how the modern practices of Halloween came to be. Halloween is actually a really odd conglomeration of what happens when a bunch of different worldviews collide. So let's get back first to its pagan roots. This goes all the way back to the Celtic festival called Samhain. It's been pronounced Samhain. I don't really know the pronunciation of this. I don't think anyone actually knows the pronunciation of this, actually. Talk to someone who's familiar with the occult. They would probably pronounce it Samhain, which was a harvest festival, and it began the new year for the Celts. Special bonfires were lit, and ceremonies were performed, and it was believed that the spirits of the dead and the nature spirits could more easily cross from their world to our world. And so food and drink were often left out for them. In people's homes, special meals were served where the ghosts of ancestors were invited to attend. And it's believed that people would dress in costumes, go door to door, many times looking for handouts or treats. Samhain was kind of a festival for the dead as the winter months approached. That's the worldview that contributed to Halloween. It's one of the worldviews that contributed to Halloween. But there's another tradition, a Christian tradition, and it originally actually had absolutely nothing to do with October 31st at all. In fact, the name Halloween is a Christian name. The name Halloween comes from All Hallows Eve, All Hallows Eve, or All Saints' Eve. It was the evening before All Saints' Day. And this goes back to the earliest centuries of the church. We're talking 2nd century. Okay? Back in the early centuries, Christians lived mostly in the Roman Empire, and they were under constant persecution. They would be okay for a while, and then another wave of persecution would go through, and a lot of Christians would be imprisoned or persecuted or even killed. So as early as the 2nd century, a tradition started. The church started to remember its fallen martyrs. And at times they would dedicate special days to those martyrs. Eventually, church leaders had this idea of combining all these days into one day where all the martyrs were honored. So that's exactly what they did. By the mid-4th century, the Christians in Antioch had what they called the Feast of All Martyrs. And they celebrated it on the first Sunday after Pentecost, which is actually the same day the Eastern Orthodox Church still celebrates All Saints' Day. Similar festivals were celebrated in other locations at different times, and the celebration started to embrace not just all martyrs, but all saints who had come before us, all the departed saints. Now, eventually, by the 7th century, May 13th was declared as the All Saints' Day for the church, for Christians everywhere. About a century later, Pope Gregory III moved All Saints' Day to November 1st. Remember, when is Halloween? October 31st, okay? So they moved it from May 13th to November 1st. And then in the 9th century, Pope Gregory IV officially fixed that day for Christians all over the world. Now, we really don't know why this move was made. We don't know why. But for the Christians living in Ireland and Scotland, what this did was it planted a very well-established Christian festival for the dead, celebrating and honoring the dead, and plopped it right on top of a pagan festival honoring the dead. So you have a Christian festival to honor the dead on top of a pagan festival to honor the dead. And as is true with a lot of things when it comes to culture, Christian theology got infused to old pagan folk beliefs. Now, we come to the modern day, and of course, Halloween traditions have changed a lot over the centuries, but we have the clash of yet another worldview that got thrown in the mix, especially in the 20th century, and that's secularism. As America became more pluralistic, Halloween has been very secularized, so that a lot of what you see out there today are just vestiges of old traditions without any religious connotations at all. People don't have any knowledge or memory of these past traditions. Most people you would ask on the street about any of these things, about Samhain or All Saints' Day, many could not tell you. They simply don't remember. And on top of that, in the 20th century, we saw the revival of pagan religions. So that still today, you have a small subset of Americans who actually use Halloween as a time to revive old pagan practices and traditions. Okay, so enough of the history lesson. What is a Christian to make of all this mess here? Is there something redeemable within Halloween? Let me ask you a question this way. If Paul was looking at Halloween traditions the way he looked at Aratus' poem, how might he mine October 31st to the glory of God? What would he find within October 31st to use for the glory of God? Is there any truth within it? I want to offer 3 ideas, and these are just ideas. I'll say these ideas to those who to anyone in the room here who might see Halloween as something just to totally receive or totally reject. You might be of the mindset where Halloween comes along and you just kind of fall in with everything. You just kind of participate. You decorate your house. You let your kids go out for trick-or-treat. You go to all the parties. You do all the stuff. And you don't really think about it. That's just, you kind of just receive it. And to anyone in here who would look at Halloween and everything about it is abhorrent, you hate it, you don't want anything to do with it, you disassociate it from in any way possible. You put a big dividing wall between you, your family, and what was going on that night on October 31st. While there are aspects of October 31st that one might simply receive or simply reject, I think Christians need a thoughtful approach to the day so that we can point to Christ. Here's how we do that. I have 3 ideas. Idea number 1, show love to your neighbor. Show love to your neighbor. You really can't go wrong here because there's really not a bad day to obey the second greatest commandment, right? For many communities like ours, Halloween is a time of widespread celebration. It might be the only day of the year that a neighbor knocks on your door. And in our fragmented lives, that's a pretty good thing. For Christians desiring to be involved in the lives of their neighbors, Halloween is a natural time to connect with others. It really actually serves as a perfect time to do like Paul said in Romans 12:21. Do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. For instance, there's one family I know, and they really go all out every year when they do this. They pull out the grills out onto their front lawn, and they give out hamburgers and hot dogs to everybody who walks by. They get out a projector, and they project a child-friendly movie up on their garage door. And they put out a bunch of chairs for little kids and for adults. And people linger. They stay. They stop trick-or-treating, and they sit, and they stay, and they converse. They talk. And nothing about their yard is dark at all. The yard is lit up with fun. It's great because people don't just move on. They linger there. They sit a while. And then this opens up great opportunities to build friendships and to share the gospel. I like this idea. It's very nice because it mimics the kind of thing that Jesus did. Do you remember in Luke chapter 15 when the Pharisees were complaining about Jesus and they said of him, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." Now that word receives doesn't just mean that Jesus was a welcoming kind of personality, because it's talking about eating together. The word actually means that he hosted meals. Whether that was in the home of one of his disciples or even at a rented banquet hall, he would be the host of a meal. And then he would invite even the notorious sinners in the town. That's idea number one, where we're redeeming the community openness aspect of Halloween. Idea number two, this one should be fun to talk about. Show people the holiness of horror. The holiness of horror. That might sound kind of weird at first, but you need to track with me here. Often we see horror, or the horror genre, as nothing but a celebration of evil. Many horror films today have kind of degenerated into an immoral display of illicit sex and violence and death. But I would argue that this is actually an abuse of the genre, not a good use of it. You see, God is not opposed to using horror to show us truth. We have to remember there are two sides to truth. There is a truthful portrayal of what is good and a truthful portrayal of what is evil. Uncovering the nature of evil is part of what it means to dwell on what is good. Brian Gadawa, who's the screenwriter for the film To End All Wars, he reminds us that God himself uses the horror genre to convey powerful truths about the true nature of evil. Listen to what he writes about the book of Revelation. He says, the book of Revelation reads like an epic horror fantasy, complete with science fiction special effects and spectacles of horror darker than anything in David Cronenberg theater of blood. In this apocalyptic prophecy, we read of huge demonic spectacle of genetically mutated monsters chasing and tormenting screaming people. Armies of bizarre beasts wreaking death and destruction on the masses. A demonic dragon chasing a woman with the intent to eat her child. A seven-headed amphibious hydra with horns that blaspheme God and draws pagan idol worship from everyone on earth. Massive famines, gross outbreaks of rotting sores covering people's bodies, plagues of demonic insects torturing populations, fire-breathing griffin-like creatures, supernatural warfare of angels and demons, the dragging of rotting corpses through the streets while people party over them, rivers of seas of blood, a blaspheming harlot doing the deed with kings and merchants, who then turn on her, strip her naked, burn her with fire, and cannibalize her. More famines, pestilence, and plagues. And when the good guys win, there's a mighty feast of vultures, scavenging the flesh of kings and commanders in victory. And I might add, all this gives glory to God in the highest. What's the point of this? The point is that horror has a good purpose. For sure, it's been hijacked by Hollywood, but this does not mean that horror is something to reject altogether. It can be redeemed. You see, the power of horror is that it teaches us that evil is not just an abstraction. The evil in our hearts is real and it is ugly. So there are many Christians, there are many ways Christians can do this. Parents, for instance, they play a big role in this. Instead of merely cloistering kids inside, parents can use the atmosphere of Halloween as a living visual aid for those kind of discussions. They can say, monsters are a great reminder of what evil really looks like on the inside. Sin may look good on the surface, but deep down, it is hideous. There's nothing wrong with a well-told ghost story or monster story. Even the Bible has them. The key is choosing your own stories carefully and then drawing from the story how sin is being portrayed as the hideous madness that it is. In some places, I've seen churches, they'll do film discussions around Halloween and they carefully select scenes from different horror films. And when this is done well, it can be fantastic. They draw people from all over the community and they discuss how the classic archetypes of evil, things like dragons and vampires, werewolves, ghosts, how they were often used as stories to show the true nature of sin. For example, centuries ago, vampire stories were often told to symbolize the sort of endless thirst and recklessness and that restless spirit inside us that represses our sinfulness, that addictive madness of sin. Or take the example of Frankenstein's monster. When Mary Shelley wrote that book, she was actually doing it in order to show the scientific pride of the Enlightenment. She was commenting on how the widespread belief that science had made us so powerful that we could become our own God, that we could do anything, that we could create life, that we could end life, that we are the decision makers of what to do with our own bodies and our own hearts. And she used horror to show us that belief leads to nothing but destruction. Have you ever read the novella by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? It's a wonderfully written story, extremely eerie. The story was written by Robert Louis Stevenson, a Presbyterian believer, and he wrote it to symbolize the dual nature of fallen human beings. On one hand, a man created in the image of God with the law of God stamped on his conscience, and on the other hand, a man totally depraved. The book is all about the futility of trying to manage or quarantine our sin. So to use horror, I would think about using the horror of the whole month of October as a conversation starter. If you see monstrous and demonic decorations, don't just shun it, use it. Do a little research if you need to. Take some time to learn some of the folklore and history behind the monsters you see. And then show how they reveal the true nature of human evil. I just did this recently, actually. I was talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to somebody, and I said something to the effect of, I know what it's like to be a Dr. Jekyll and a Mr. Hyde. Left on my own, I have seen what kind of dark and selfish impulses I have. And I have learned far too well that you can't just give your dark side freedom and then try to quarantine it. Evil always wants more. I've seen this in my own life. When I want to do good, evil is right there with me. This is why I'm so grateful for what Jesus Christ has done. Not only does he forgive me for all my hypocrisy and all the hurtful things that I've done, but he actually empowers me to live differently. I don't have to repress sin or ignore it, but neither do I let it run wild. Instead, he fills me with new desires that I never even had before, and that overcomes the sin inside. We can redeem horror. Moving to idea number 3, teach people that Halloween is meant to be a mockery of the devil. A mockery of the devil. What do I mean by this? Well, remember this history of Halloween. As the Christians were celebrating All Saints' Eve And as that was colliding with pagan practices in Europe, it was an opportunity for Christians to show the contrast between Christ and other spirits. All Saints' Eve was a way the church was trying to redeem the day. For instance, a tradition began in medieval Europe where the children of a village, they would all dress in scary costumes and they would dance and parade in the streets. Now, this was not to revel in evil or darkness, but to mock it. I want you to catch this. This is where our tradition of dressing up as weird outfits comes from. You see, what they were doing was they were acting out a drama. It was a dramatization of the powers of darkness, trying one last time to take control. But then the morning sun would always vanquish the night. It was a way of teasing the powers of darkness and celebrating that Christ has the final victory over them. This is where the portrayal of the devil wearing a red suit with the horns and the tail and everything, that's where this comes from. They didn't believe that the devil looked like that. It was to make him look silly. It was to make him look stupid. It was a mockery of Satan. John Frame from Reformed Theological Seminary, he comments on this. He writes, "In its missionary labors of Europe, the church substituted its own holiday for some of pagan observance. In the modern West, Halloween is essentially a mockery of ancient paganism. It is not paganism, but a celebration of the gospel's victory over paganism. I see no spiritual danger in observing that celebration as long as we and our children understand the difference between mocking paganism and endorsing it." This idea of mocking evil is all over the Bible. It's all over the Bible. Think of every time an Old Testament prophet wrote or spoke some mocking comment about the futility of idols or some other god. The language is often full of sarcasm, full of satire. Or think of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Right after proclaiming this wonderful truth about Jesus' resurrection, he finishes by mocking death. He finishes with this prophetic, he quotes the prophet Hosea, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? Thanks be to God who gives victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." He's mocking death. Because of what Christ has done, he died for our sins and he conquered the power of death. We can legitimately humiliate the devil. I want you to catch that. We can legitimately humiliate the devil. In his letter to the Colossians, Paul says that Christ, having disarmed the powers and authorities, that's the demonic spirits, having disarmed the powers and authorities, Christ made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in the cross. Do you catch what Paul is doing here? He's actually using a word of military victory, where the winning commander of the army would drag the soldiers of the defeated army through the streets, often stripped down, no weapons, totally defeated, to mock the army, to mock the defeated army. That's the same word he uses here. It's as if Christ has stripped down the weapons of the powers of darkness and has drugged them through the streets and says, "I have won." He's mocking the powers of darkness. They are lions without teeth. People need to know this about Halloween. That at its core, it was a time to remember that the saints who have passed from this life are not lost. Why? Because Christ died for their sins and gave them peace with God. They are not really dead at all. They are united to the risen Christ. People in other cultures, in our culture, should know that all the ghosts and all the demonic outfits, they stem from a tradition that wasn't celebrating evil, it was mocking it. If you want a good conversation starter with your neighbors about Jesus, here's a great one. You can tell them the history of Halloween from hundreds of years ago and say, "See, there's so much about this day that I actually really like. But just like Christmas, it's kind of just been buried under a lot of commercialism and a lot of renewed interest in things that don't matter. It used to be such a great celebration of Jesus. These costumes didn't used to be celebrations of evil. These costumes didn't used to celebrate evil. It was a mockery of evil. It was a way to portray the powers of darkness, trying in vain to get a hold again, but to no end. Then you can tell them how Jesus defeated Satan. He stripped him of the two weapons he had, our sin and death. He took care of our sin on the cross, and he took care of death in his resurrection. As one former Satanist, who's now a Christian pastor, put it, enjoy Halloween. How? By being free. I know that the theme of death surrounds the celebration of Halloween. I know that the activities of Halloween had pagan beginnings. I know that there's even criminally minded occultists that do every evil thing on Halloween. But that does not nullify the reality that we are not to be dominated by any of this. We can celebrate life instead of death. So these are just a few ideas. Show love to your neighbors to redeem the community openness of Halloween. Use the elements of horror to remind people about the reality of the ugliness of human sin. And then teach people that Halloween is really a mockery of the devil, thanks to all that Christ has done. Now, you'll notice here I didn't talk about how to decorate your home, or if your kids should go trick-or-treating, or if you should attend a Halloween party. And I think those things are largely up to your own conscience. But I'll say this. This year, inform your conscience by what All Saints' Eve really is all about. What the church intended it to be. And then start your own traditions in your home. Or start your traditions with some of your friends here in our church. Talk to your spouse, talk to your kids, talk to your good friends here at church, and ask them, if we were to come up with a new Halloween tradition that really brought glory to God and that redeems the day of Halloween in our culture, what would those traditions look like? How can we capitalize on the themes of Halloween that are true so that we can redeem those truths for a godly purpose?